Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. My name is Robert Diggs, and I am the Community and Partnerships Lead for RSA US. On behalf of our event partner, Forum for the Future Americas, I'd like to thank you all for joining us for this month's US Salon, Taking Futures and Foresight into the Everyday. Before we get started, I'd like to give a little background about the RSA, RSA US, and cover some ground rules about today's event. Founded in the UK, RSA stands for the Royal Society for the Encouragement of the Arts, Manufactures, and Commerce, and has been uniting people and ideas to resolve the challenges of our time since 1754. Today, the Society exists as an international fellowship-driven think tank committed to providing an independent platform for research and debate on contemporary issues and topics. Of the 30,000 fellows spread out around the globe, about 1,000 live and work here in the United States, including George. RSA US exists to coordinate fellowship activities in the United States with an aim towards moving the needle on addressing the inequities of our society. Before I turn things over to our event moderator, Adana, our colleague from RSA, who will then introduce herself, introduce the topic, and then in turn have our speakers introduce themselves. I would like to cover some ground rules about the event. And while I'm covering these ground rules, please be sure to keep renaming yourselves with first name, last name, or initial, or last name or surname initial, and where you're calling in from through the rename yourself function. But just want to make sure that you're all aware the event is being recorded. So we're recording through YouTube. That's why there's a live on YouTube button at the top of the window. You can use the chat to raise any questions or ask for points of clarification. We do come from different backgrounds, cultures, and countries. So don't hesitate to ask if something is unfamiliar. However, please be respectful. Use language your mother or mom would approve of. I do not hesitate to remove those who violate these norms from our events. When we get to the open discussion portion of the event in about 40 minutes, I'll ask you to use the raise hand function to sort of queue up if you want to ask a question live. If not, you're free to ask your questions in the chat. With that, I will leave these meeting notes up so they're ingrained in your psyche while Adana introduces herself and our topic for the day. Adana.
Thanks so much, Diggs. Hi, everyone. My name is Adanna Shalu. I'm the Senior Global Manager at the RSA. I'm calling in from Trinidad and Tobago in the Caribbean, and I'm really honored to be hosting this conversation on foresight, taking foresight into the everyday. The catalyst for today's salon was actually an RSA report, A Stitch in Time, which was published last fall. It was a research partnership we did with the Manchester Metropolitan University in the UK. And as you can imagine, working on that report about foresight, which is essentially about how it was urgent. And at its core, the report sought to highlight the value of foresight and futures to policymaking. We approached the report not as specialists, we are not futurists, but rather curious generalists. And some of the core takeaways from the report was about how can we think more differently about the future, when actually, to be honest, to think about the future and to plan ahead is actually something that is very human. Foresight and Futures offers a way to think about and approach some of our more intractable, complex social challenges. However, the tools and methods and change practices tend to focus more on understanding what happened in the past, on hindsight, rather than emphasizing how we can reimagine new alternative futures. A crucial challenge relates to the idea of legitimate futures, which asks the question, whose future is it? And who has the power to decide the future? Is it academics? Is it experts? Is it policymakers? And we also realized, of course, through the research that organizations and institutions need to account for the long-term impact of short-term actions. Because if we're not acting in ways that will enable our descendants to thrive on this planet, we are actually colonizing their future. Yet it is impossible to underestimate the impact that incentives that drive short-termism has done to our existing reality. We need to find new creative ways to value the long run. I'm so looking forward to going to this and more with our incredible guests, Alicia Bagat and George Gantz. I will now invite them to introduce themselves and to tell us what drew you to the practice of foresight and long-term thinking. Alicia?
Thanks, Adana, and thank you, Diggs, and hello, George, and hello, everybody. I'm so happy to be part of this conversation today with everybody. So I think to answer this question is like a long and windy path, because I don't think any child is going to school these days thinking like, I want to be a futurist. So my path to kind of futures foresight, futures thinking, strategic thinking in that way sort of came through a windy road. I did my master's in foreign policy, and I was just really interested in policy as a means to create change. I started off my career in working for US intelligence and security agencies, and it was there that I learned about kind of this tool that we put in this category of foresight and futures thinking, of really systematically and strategically thinking about the future. And I think when it used in kind of military and defense applications, very much this thinking is rooted in risk management and mitigation, going through worst case scenarios, looking at preparedness. So it was actually a very great grounding in sort of what this tool very, very practically can be used for, and how, these institutions that we have spent a lot of time and really great minds thinking through, how to use scenario planning for thinking about issues like bioterrorism, like climate change, related conflicts, ocean health and ocean related conflict, etc. So I thought that was very interesting, but I've always really been interested in social change and sustainable development. So I found kind of my way to Forum for the Future, which is a nonprofit based in the UK with offices all over the world, including where I'm based in New York, that uses the same tools of foresight and futures thinking and applies them to kind of great global challenges around sustainability, around sustainable development as relating to people and planet. So that's kind of my career path. But I think that what really excites me about the future is that the future is sort of this fertile ground for us to, fertile and somewhat neutral ground for us to kind of collectively dream, imagine, and create things together. And it's the act of kind of activating our imagination to challenge the assumptions that we have about the present. That is what excites me about working on the future with groups. So it provides that opportunity that, as Adanna mentioned, just like kind of talking about what happened in the past or getting overwhelmed with the complexity of the present, the future allows us kind of a new space to explore and can be really exciting. So that's me.
Thanks so much, Alicia. George?
Okay. Adana, thank you. Diggs, thank you for bringing this together. Alicia, that was a wonderful introduction and great to hear it. My pathway was a bit different. When I was a child, I was very interested in kind of big questions and avid science fiction reader. I went to college, I studied mathematics and philosophy, and then went off and got a career, got married, raised a family. And when I was able to, and as part of my career, I worked for a utility system doing strategic planning and communication. So I kind of worked in the futures field, but in a very limited capacity at that point. And then I was able to retire early and began studying and thinking and writing, and took a real fascination with not only following the thread of philosophical thought and working on how do we become wise, but clearly seeing that there was so much happening in the world today and so many very interesting explorations of how do we affect the future? How do we make the future? So I began to get involved and found some interesting organizations. RSA was one of them. Long Now Foundation was another. Santa Fe Institute, Templeton Foundation. And a few years ago, I got more directly involved with the Long Now movement through our organization here in Boston. It's the Long Now Boston organization, independent but philosophically aligned with the Long Now Foundation. And the goal there is really trying to break the cycle of short-termism that so infects our society and our civilization right now. How do we get people to break out and think about things from a longer-term perspective? And one of the things I like about the Long Now Foundation, it tries to measure things in a decimillennial cycle. Let's think 10,000 years out, and and see if we can imagine what that's like. So working with Long Now Boston, I've been curating the speaker series now for the last 3 years, helping to find speakers and bring them in. And it's been very exciting. And in spite of the very big challenges that we face, there's a lot of interesting thinking going on and a lot of interesting work that makes me more optimistic. And of course, the real powerful motivation for me right now to think about the future is, I don't know if you can see the photo in the background, but I have 8, soon to be 9 grandchildren, and I am passionate about making the world better for them. So here we are.
Thanks so much, George. George, you didn't mention the fact that you're a writer as well, and I wanted to point the audience to your piece, A Tip of the Spear, where you highlighted the importance of trust and empathy in trying to shape the future. Can you talk about the roles of trust in changing minds and how futurists might utilize their networks to demystify the practice of foresight?
Yeah, thank you, Adana. That's one of the emerging questions in an age when we seem to be beset with a decline in levels of trust and willingness to listen to other people. The author and a speaker at Long Now Boston recently was Vincent Iolente, who coined the phrase the deflation of expertise. And as he talks about that as a problem that is equal in importance and difficulty to dealing with the Anthropocene, which is kind of the topic of all the climate change work that's going on. So it's a problem that has arisen in part because of the environment of fear and uncertainty, and accelerated by the social media that has allowed us to create these bubbles of self-reinforcing misinformation, and the human interest in novelty. So the conspiracy theories get a lot more play than the steady media coverage of particular events. So we have a lot of things going on that are kind of disrupting the model that we've had of being able to rely on experts for guidance and trust those experts. You mentioned I wrote an essay for the Foundational Questions Institute in 2014 called The Tip of the Spear. They posed the question, how should humanity steer the future? And so my response was essentially evolutionary theory and religion are all telling us the same thing. Life is better if you build it around cooperation, trust, and trust ultimately rests on the empathy of the individual trying to work together. So the analogy was, in terms of the future of humanity, science was going to continue to be the power, the engine that drives civilization forward, but we have to arm the tip of the spear with the human qualities of empathy and be able to collaborate, cooperate, trust each other, because without trust, all of the institutions that we have would start falling apart. So as we think about the study of futures and foresight and putting that into practice, that's really our biggest challenge. I think both the Stitch in Time report and the Transformation report are fabulous pieces of work. And I really want to see the agendas from those reports, continue to find their way forward, because that futures and foresight is the way we're going to turn the tide of short-termism into a more long-term thinking mode, and only with long-term thinking are we really going to be able to get us out of the current cycle of kind of well, whatever you want to call it, not going in the right direction. So they're both great reports, but now how do we make this tangible? How do we inspire people? And that is based upon trust, trust grounded in empathy. And how do you do that in a world that's increasingly polarized and increasingly split apart? You have to find a way to not only inspire the minds, but really inspire the heart. So that's the challenge of the day, and that's where empathy comes in. And so how do we do that? We already know in climate change from the studies that more data, more facts, more rhetoric, more fear is counterproductive, because the mindset of people today is, they can go into their bubbles and be happy. So how do we inspire conversations that really reach people's hearts? And that's the secret, I think, to demystifying futures and foresight, and finding a way to generate those conversations and have things move forward on that kind of a basis. And just one example of how this can be done in practice is from the city of Boston. Some years ago, they initiated a program called Imagine Boston 2030. And they began by going out into the neighborhoods and communities and the metro stations and asking people questions about what they saw, what they felt, what they envisioned for the future. Then they went into a workshop mode where they gathered people together, and they built trust in that process that enabled these citizens to participate in an envisioning of the future. And now they've integrated that citywide into the planning process for all the departments, and they're implementing their Imagine Boston 2030, and they're planning on revisiting that every 10 years. And I think that's a way of it opened up the city from the inside out, and it also brought the outside into the organization. And I'm confident now that Boston in 10,000 years is still going to be a vibrant, wonderful city. So hopefully that helps. Looks like Adana is frozen up for the moment, at least my machine.
Yeah,
Diggs.
sorry.
Yeah.
No worries. This is why we plan ahead. But
so
if you're
much,
just joining us, just so you know. Oh, you are there, Adana. Great. Well, no, I think we lost Adana for the time being. But just so everybody knows, Adana is home in her home country of Trinidad, and they're still dealing with the COVID lockdown for the entire island. So sometimes the telecom is a little stretched and taxed at high peak hours like now. So I'll just jump in and ask the next question of Alicia, which was earlier. You mentioned your experience with Decolonizing Futures. Would you speak a little about your membership in the Diaspora Futures Collective and your work with Forum for the Future?
Sure, yeah, thanks, Diggs. And there's kind of many similar themes to what George touched upon there around kind of narratives about the future, and there being sort of people not resonating anymore with like an excess of data. So kind of how to reach people on an emotional level. But my work with Decolonizing Futures, so this is kind of a current big piece of work that's not just me, it's the field of kind of foresight, and I think in many different fields, this topic of decolonization is coming up. And kind of what does that mean and how does that look? And I think that we're right now, going through a period of time in which a lot of our kind of systems and structures are being re-examined. So certainly we saw that last year. But the Diaspora Futures Collective is a group of, futurists who identify as people of color, who kind of get together to rethink some of the dominant frameworks and paradigms about the future, to collaborate, to kind of avoid tokenism, and just provide a space for us to talk to each other about what we're seeing, what we're spotting, and how we might even start to think about decolonizing our own thinking And it sort of came about last year amidst a lot of the crises and upheavals that were going on. And I think in part because a lot of what was happening in a number of things with COVID, with Black Lives Matter, with a lot of climate justice activism, events leading up to the US election, was sort of this feeling that like the world is in crisis, and all of these really terrible things are happening all at once, or you know, people are suddenly becoming aware about you know, the violence enacted on people of color in America or something. You know, it was this sort of general awareness. And I think from people within marginalized communities, there was sort of this like, yes, we've been feeling like, yes, we've been saying this. And we knew that this existed, but people are kind of on a broader scale awakening to it now. So there was sort of a change that happened within organizations, and I think within people thinking like, well, what can we do about it? And how do we sort of start to enact changes that make the system better? So we formed this group to kind of think that through. And so I don't have the answers. I think that we're still trying to figure out what that means. But a lot of it is about kind of really trying to dig deep into our mental models and frameworks to examine, you know, why we are thinking in certain ways, why we are repeating the problems of the past, why are we kind of, you know, not thinking outside of the box. And that's really similar to the kind of work that I'm doing with Forum for the Future as I am part of the Futures team at Forum. So kind of an example that I will share, with a couple of examples with Forum. One is just a really simple example. So when I said in the beginning that Futures allows us a place to imagine and rethink our assumptions, that is really what a good piece of science fiction does, right? It presents a world where it provides kind of systemic changes that then you rethink your assumptions about kind of who is human and what is human, you know, how would we live, how would we organize ourselves, etc. So that's kind of what science fiction does. In terms of what is going on today and applying foresight to our world, it's trying to get that same effect. So for example, at Forum, we worked for many years on this tea project called Tea 2030. And the project really was looking at how would we create a more sustainable tea industry. And really through the project, it became apparent that a lot of the assumptions that we have around the tea industry are really deep-seated and rooted in the kind of structures that were put into place a long time ago during, like, you know, a colonial period and an unequal power structure. So just we take it for granted that tea has to be grown on a plantation, that these sorts of crops require a plantation to grow, and a plantation requires extractive labor in some sense. So people have that mental model in their heads. And so we keep trying to force ourselves to make it better without kind of thinking like, does this system have inherent flaws in it that need to be reimagined? And then the idea that, oh yes, like we think that this product should really cost like, you know, 2 cents per tea bag. That is the value of this. Is that something that we need to challenge and re-examine? And then thinking through what would a future look like in which those mental models were challenged and a different system was put into place. So thinking through that at Forum is kind of what we do on a number of issues, another one being our work on post-COVID-19 trajectories, and thinking that, you know, we don't want to see a return to business as normal. There's many things that would be great if they come back, like, you know, I'm in New York and I'm so excited to go back to the theater and go back to outdoor concerts and restaurants, but there's a lot of things about the way the world was pre-COVID-19 that I don't think are so great. So how can we use this as an opportunity to reimagine a new normal and set ourselves up for kind of a better future, rather than saying like, let us just now reset to exactly the way the world was, you know, December of 2019, and then just go back. So that's kind of my take on decolonizing. There isn't a great set of solutions. It's more of like a live and active inquiry in which we and others invite people in to kind of think about our own selves, decolonizing ourselves, our own thinking, and then kind of the institutions and organizations that we work with.
Great, thanks so much, Alicia. George, you mentioned earlier that you serve as the speaker curator for Long Now Boston. Can you speak a little bit about the Long Now movement, particularly around what your goals are in finding and sourcing and working with speakers to promote long-term thinking?
Sure, thank you, Adana. I call it the Long Now movement. I'm not sure everybody in the organizations would, but the Long Now Foundation was started a couple of decades ago by Stuart Brand and some of his friends. Some people may know Stuart as the author of the Whole Earth Catalog and a leader of some aspects of the environmental movement and the New Age movement. It was really some people getting together to think about how do we, inspire the imagination to think in the long term. So they picked the 10,000 year time frame. They started the Clock Project. They've got a Panlex project to translate every language into every other language. They've got a library for the future that, if civilization collapsed and you had that library, you could rebuild it. So it's was a start to try to think about how to get people to think long term. What's been happening, I think, more recently is a lot of people are starting to talk about it, and there's a diaspora of the RSA with 30,000 fellows around the world. Long Now Foundation has people around the world that are becoming passionate about this subject, and some of them are forming little groups in other cities. And one of those was in Boston, the greater Boston area, Cambridge, Boston, and we like to talk about the fact that we've got 70 universities and colleges in the area, lots of students, lots of energy, and lots of people in the tech sector. So that began to organize as an independent group, and now we do a monthly conversation series. And I think early on it was a little bit hard to get speakers. It's getting easier. We've had, I think, 40 events and some 50 or 60 speakers, some of whom are quite well known, at least in the field. And particularly what we found is in the last year with COVID, we had to go virtual, but that also made us geographically unlimited. So in the past year, we've had speakers from London and Vancouver and New York, and it's been kind of an opportunity to speak more broadly. And one of our speakers was the historian of the RSA, Anton Howes, about his book on the RSA. Long Now is interested in the RSA because it's 250 years old. Well, how do you have a nonprofit, good for the public organization last 250 years? You have to reinvent yourself. So we're interested in long-termism. How do we help promote that kind of thinking? Another one from London, by the way, you can see on my back wall here is a poster that's an invitation to the biggest party of all time that's going to be held on June 6th in 2269. So again, trying to inspire people to think in longer terms and think about ways now to make that practical. I think one of our speakers, Bina Venkatraman, is the author of The Optimist Telescope and is a senior opinion editor at the Boston Globe. She put it this way, that long-term thinking has to become a short-term priority. Now, that's a bit of a conundrum, but that's what we're trying to do in our organization. And with this diaspora taking place, I view this as kind of an ecology of thinking. And particularly we have Long Now, we have RSA, we have Forum for the Future, we have the Center for Existential Risk. We've got all of these different groups, one way or another, are all working towards the same effort. And I see it as an ecology that is getting more robust and stronger. And the more we can work together, the more we can get these ideas out there, the better off we're going to be. So that's a little bit about Long Now Boston.
Thanks so much, George. Alicia. During an institutional context, you were, how do you approach an internship?
Sure. So if anyone didn't catch that, the question is right there. So hopefully we're all on the same page here. There's a lot of parts that are, a lot of areas of overlap. So when we work with organizations, I think the thought process is really similar, which is organizations don't really like to think long-term. They think that they do, but they generally, when they say long-term, they mean the next 5 years. So getting organizations to break out of very short-term kind of quarterly cycle performance mindsets to think long-term is challenging. And I think that it was very interesting to see how that played out last year. And I guess I'd be interested to hear what you have to say about it too, George, in that when the pandemic hit, everyone went into like super short-term thinking mode because it was like a matter of survival. So people were very much focused on, what am I doing? How do I stay safe? How does my family stay safe? And the thought of any sort of long-term planning fell by the wayside. And that is true in my experience in working with organizations that had kind of big ambitions and stuff. A lot of stuff just went on hold because people thought, I really have to think like, will my industry survive this pandemic? What does this mean for the future of cities? What does this mean for the future of, the food industry and so on? So I think there was that kind of panic. And I think that once there was sort of like a place of some modicum of like, we got over the initial panic, there's a little bit of stability, people were able to start thinking again. And that's really when that long-term mindset in the short term came to bear. And I think that that's really when people started thinking like, oh, well, we need to start working with other organizations. This needs to be collaborative. These changes that are happening are not happening to one specific company. They're happening to an entire city, the city of New York being hard hit by the pandemic early on. They're happening to entire regions. They're happening to, various groupings of specific groups of people being more impacted, economically and health-wise than others. So I think that kind of made that, more clear. And that's kind of when the work has sort of begun and the rethinking of what the future could hold has happened. And we've definitely seen that within Forum and our organization in terms of what projects are interesting, what problems people are interested in solving and how.
Thanks so much, Alicia. Just before I hand over to Diggs for audience questions, I just have one question for both of you. I just want to circle back to this idea of narrative and storytelling. And for both of you, can you unpack the idea of a decaying narrative that is quite pervasive in our society and how the question, whose future is it, will impact how the technical side of the practice can be embedded into our everyday lives? This could be for Alicia or George, or both.
Alicia, do you want to try that one?
Okay, I'll give it a quick pass. So one of the things that I was kind of thinking about with regards to the future is, not everyone, and I don't think that everyone thinks that the future is going to be good. And I don't mean this in a dystopian way. But I think that a certain narrative of the future, if we want to get very nerdy, Jim Dater, one of the founders of future studies, would calls this in his archetypes, there's a continued growth archetype. And so we have this narrative of there's going to be continued growth. Each generation will be better off than the last. You have a faith that your kids will do better than you, or at least enjoy the same lifestyle as you, and so on. And I think we've reached the point where, you know, I'm a very old millennial, but millennials have and beyond have sort of realized that, yeah, maybe that's not going to happen. So that narrative that people grew up hearing maybe won't be true. And what does that mean? And what actions are we responsible in taking to not necessarily make that future come true, but make the future that we would want come true? So if that is a decaying narrative, you know, what's the alternative narrative? And then how do we work together to build that collective future? I think that's you know, something that's like currently happening and being discussed, and I find that really fascinating. But yeah, I do think that that will inform the technical side of the practice for sure, in that, you know, we're not just doing a risk analysis given our existing growth archetype. We're doing something else, which is, you know, challenging that and rewriting that archetype altogether. And so I think how it sort of embeds in everyday life is just really how we then think about, you know, the policies we vote on, the life decisions that we make, you know, all of the choices that people make in their lives about, like, even when to get married and whether to have kids, like that then becomes embedded based on that worldview. So I think that while the terms foresight may not be in everybody's everyday life, certainly the archetype, the mindset that they have about the future is, and in so much as they can be empowered to collectively shape it and try to make it more positive, I think that will be, you know, be beneficial.
Yeah, Alicia, that was great. I appreciate what you were saying about that, the view that the younger generation has of their future. And I think it's been the case. I mean, I'm a boomer, 70, and pretty much the expectation among my generation was that we were going to be better off than our parents and our grandparents. That began to change, I think, in the 70s and 80s. We had, you know, hyperinflation and, you know, things not going well. And I think now for a good full generation, there's been a change in that expectation, at least in, you know, in the US, that, you know, we're not going to be as well off as our parents. And, you know, and I would say that's probably true among my kids, and I think they're worried about their kids. And so that is a worldview about the future that's a little bit troubling, because we're going to have to figure out how to overcome that. And the other thing about that, I like the word colonization, in the sense of, if you look at all of the entertainment industry, you look at science fiction today, it's dominated by dystopia. So in that sense, we, as expressed in that entertainment, you know, venue, that part of our culture, is colonizing the future with a really negative view. And, you know, we ought to think about changing that. And there's one organization I'm aware of called Sapiens Plurum that runs a writing contest for positive views of the future, which I think is a really nice counterpoint to some of the dystopianism. The other thing I wanted to mention about narrative, that's really a kind of a big picture thing. You know, we've had a narrative for a couple of centuries, you know, the Enlightenment narrative of, you know, human virtues, working together, collective thriving, rationalism, empirical science, you know, as ultimately beneficial and optimistic. And those are the principles that the RSA was founded on 250 years ago. I think that narrative is really being undermined, and we're maybe at risk of losing that compass in part because of this polarization and fractioning of culture, and so the fear and the uncertainty and the unknowns that are pressing in upon us. And so finding ways to build a positive narrative, reinvent the Enlightenment. Certainly Steven Pinker is trying to do that, and others, reinventing that narrative in a way that that people are going to be able to feel is real. So, confront the dystopian narratives, build a sense, look, the world is a lot better than it used to be, even though we might think differently. In a lot of ways, we still have a lot of work to do, but, let's work together to work for a better future for our children's and our grandchildren, and, ultimately out to the seventh generation. If you want to go out to 2269, I think that's a good marker in the sand. So that's part of this, decolonizing, reimagining, creating a story, and in a way, it has to be at the individual level. As I said, people make their choices based on their heart, and so something has to appeal to their heart so that they can say, yeah, this is something that is meaningful to me, and I can believe in this story of the future. I can start working with other people on this story for the future, and we can solve these problems together. So if we can kind of build that narrative into our expert presentations and in the communications across the broad base of the people we're dealing with, I think that's positive. And I think, I've sometimes said, we have 8 billion people more or less in the world, and I pretty much trust those people to be nice, or try to be nice. Cultural impetus is, happens, but I trust people at core to be nice. But, as we aggregate together in groups and institutions, and those institutions take a life of their own, and, and politics comes into play, and, mistrust comes into play, that's where we run off the rails. And so if we can get back to that trust in individuals, humans, to be kind and do the right thing most of the time, maybe that's one of those narratives that we can really help drive forward.
Thanks so much, George. Diggs, I think it's time for audience questions.
It is, and so I'm going to stop sharing my screen, but thank you, Adana. But you're not done, because now you get to be part of the panel of wise folks who get to answer questions. So if you haven't already seen, we've got 2 people in the queue as I sort of reset things to pin our speakers to your field of view. And as I do that, I am going to let you know that the first one is Mitch from Mamaroneck. So I'm going to also add you to this field so they can see you as you're speaking. And then second is Bob, and then we'll go from there if others raise their hand if we have time. So without further ado, Mitch, and you have to accept the invitation.
Okay. So you can now hear me, right? Okay. So George, nice to see you again. Everybody,
nice to see you, Mitch.
Thank you all for your great presentations. It's interesting, and one of the things that kept on hitting my mind was that we're treating everything as if most people are treating things as if there's one best solution, and all we need is expertise or data or analysis to come up with that one solution, and then everything will be fine. And yet we live in a complex system, not a complicated system, but a complex system where we really don't know what the future is going to be bringing in. And so we need, as individuals, to promote a growth mindset, and as a whole, as the entire Earth, we have to get everybody into a group growth mindset. So I was thinking, like, what are you seeing? What successful efforts into getting people to understand that, hey, things aren't going to work the first time, but we're in a growth mindset. Every time we try something, we're getting a step forward, and being willing to give people a little bit more slack when things don't work out the very first time.
Mitch, that's a great question. The word growth means a lot of different things to different people. And I have a problem with it because I think most people think of growth as, growing GDP and everything, more and more and more and more. But I think if we reframe that, maybe there's a different word around the concept of thriving.
Sorry, there's a Carol, I'm using the term of Carol Dweck. So Carol Dweck coined the term that there's a fixed mindset and a growth mindset. So the fixed mindset is you're smart or you're not smart. And the growth mindset.
Growing pie, shrinking pie. Yeah, okay, that makes a lot of sense, because in an environment of a shrinking pie, everybody's going to be fearful and afraid and protective. And then it brings out your worst behaviors. But if you can believe that things are expansive, maybe that's a different word, expansive and thriving, it doesn't necessarily mean, more factories and more pollution and more, it just doesn't, and more damage to the environment. But it's thriving, and it's collective thriving, and it's upward, and that is part of the Enlightenment mindset, that enthusiasm may be too strong, but that positive sense of forward movement, that collectively we can work together, we can move it forward. And we don't have to be afraid of losing, because it will be a growing pie of thriving that everybody can participate in. And that's one of the problems I think we have today, is that there's been tremendous growth in the past 40 years or so, but it is not equally distributed.
Right.
And that's actually, if everybody were the same and a little bit impoverished, that might be one thing. But the fact that
when Bill Gates walks into a room, everybody in the room becomes, the average person is a millionaire, right?
So growth, thinking about thriving, because clearly not everybody's been thriving, because of the unequal distribution of those gains that have happened particularly in the last 40 years, but the last century too. But I like that thriving. I like that positive worldview. That is something that I think people can, if you can create a believable narrative around that, that's something I think people can get excited about. Thanks.
Any other reflections before I go to Bob? Okay.
Thank you.
The only word I would add in there is abundance. So I like the word abundance more than growth, because it sort of implies that we do actually have enough for everybody. We just don't, we've created systems of inequality that don't distribute it as we would wish to. But go ahead, Bob.
All right, Bob, 1 second. I'm going to give you the ability to unmute.
Thank you. Nice to see you again, George.
Yeah, Bob.
And thanks to you and Alicia. I live on Martha's Vineyard. I'm with an organization called Vineyard Future Works. And part of our purpose is attempting to try to get 6 distinct towns and town governments who occupy this one island to cooperate. And that's been impossible for almost as long as the RSA has existed. And it's only partially helped by disruptions like climate change and a pandemic. So there are positive signs. But for the topic of the day, what process might be used to align a community or a group of communities on a preferred future for their community?
Yeah, I mentioned the process that Boston used, Imagine 2030, Imagine Boston 2030. And, I think that's probably best practices. It's hard work. It's kind of community organizing work around envisioning a future as opposed to advocacy. Most of the time at the local level, we think we get together to advocate and go impress the powers that be that they ought to do the right thing. Well, this is a different way of trying to empower people locally. And the other thing is we still have to deal with differences. There are going to be differences of opinion. So somehow we have to have buy-in for the fact that there's going to be a legitimate process of adjudicating differences and coming up with best solutions that not everybody's going to be happy with, but everybody is going to be able to accept. And that's, you know, the theory behind democracy is that's what you're going to get. It doesn't always work out that way. And strong opinions in a context of conflict can often kind of halt the process. So that's just human nature. And again, backing up and trying to come at it from the, you know, from our best selves. The angels of our better nature, I think, is the way Steven Pinker put it. But yeah, good luck. You'll be at it another 250 years on Martha's Vineyard, I'm sure.
Bob, I would add that there's some work that was done in Hawaii called Hawaii, I think it was Hawaii 2060. And that was another community-driven futures visioning process that was kind of in an island context. So maybe if you combine Hawaii and Boston, you somehow will get a Martha's Vineyard. But you know, it kind of that work speaks to also the issues of being on an island. I mean, similar work was done in Maine. So there's lots of kind of examples of that, and using the conversation about the future really, as I mentioned, a neutral ground for people. So it's a little bit more exciting and neutral than, you know, like how do we fix our school budget, which can become a little more contentious. So I guess I would offer that, and I would also just add on the additional point that what we're looking at is multiple futures, because, you know, different people, depending on their vantage point, and different organizations have different views of the future. And I do think that there are ways in which those multiple futures can be held and potentially coexist. So there probably won't end with like one vision, you know, for the future of Martha's Vineyard, but potentially there's multiple futures that people are happy with aspects of that, you know, then can be implemented or seen as a North Star in sort of guiding cooperation and more positive dialogue.
Alicia, that's great. I'm reminded of one last thing. You know, when you look at the past, there's one past, but you look at the future, it's virtually infinite. And our goal is to find a journey that takes us to the best future we can find. Totally. Alicia, I agree with that 100%. Thanks.
Yeah, I will only add, those were amazing comments from the panelists. I will only add, you know, obviously highly recommend looking at the small island states of the world, particularly in the Caribbean, may offer some insight for you in Martha's Vineyard. By the way, I absolutely love your background, Bob. I will also add, really important to have a plurality of participation, making sure that as many voices as possible are represented and are able to participate in the process. And also, I will also encourage having an intergenerational conversation, having the very young and the elderly being part of that visioning exercise, because so many different perspectives are illuminated when you have an intergenerational conversation.
Very helpful. Thank you.
Adana, can I ask one question of
Sure.
Alicia, with your work in institutions? You know, islands are a good example of human institutions with fixed boundaries that can become entrenched. And I think the story of Easter Island is, you know, kind of one of those. So, Alicia, what can we do to help institutions become unentrenched when they're kind of stuck? You've thought about that? And, you know,
oh man, I wish I held all the answers. I guess I would just say that institutions are made up of individuals, and if we can, as much as we can identify the individuals within an institution that are particularly passionate and interested in change, interested in kind of shifting the narrative, and then kind of elevate and support those individuals and empower them to kind of build up. Every organization that I've worked with, there was at least one person who was kind of the champion of the new way of thinking the process. And so I think it would just be impossible to do it without that. But that's at least my way forward, is to kind of try to figure out who those folks are and try to empower them and elevate them and give them the tools that they need to bring more people in.
Thank you.
Diggs?
I am here. I'm sorry. I need to add myself to the pins. But before I do the sort of closeout spiel, I know, Adana, you wanted to mention one thing.
Yeah, I mean, the birth of this salon was an incredible conversation with George, and we had another incredible conversation with Alicia. Hopefully you get to do it in person over a drink or two, just saying. The team that wrote the Stitch in Time report very much want to continue these conversations. So right now we are scoping out the idea of having a global network that centers long-term thinking and foresight and futures thinking. So watch this space, as we say in the UK, or stay tuned, as we say in the US, and we'll be in touch with more in the coming months.
Awesome. Well, with that, I love the pin view, so I'm just going to leave it here. Usually I turn it all off and let people clap. But if you're willing to be on camera and do one of these with me, to thank our panelists, Alicia and George and Adana, for your expert moderation. Thank you. Or clap in with the reactions. Thank you, Mitch and Vicky. As all have asked, yes, this has been recorded. I'm hopeful that I'll be able to turn it around faster than tomorrow afternoon, but sometimes YouTube plays up on me and I have to take a little bit more time to actually get the clips down. But you'll definitely get some follow-up information that will include all of the links that were shared in the chat. I'm going to try to save the chat so I can get you those links. And be on the lookout. We will come back with more information on the work that Adana was mentioning. Please reread those reports we shared earlier. If this topic is of interest, they both can really offer some great insight for you as to how to really embed this work, this practice into your life. But with that, it's time to end. Thank you all for joining us.